When my father said a woman was good for nothing, he would look into my eyes as if he wanted to erase me from the world. I was only 7 years old when I understood that being born a girl in that house was a condemnation I would carry for my entire life. My name is Sarah Williams, and I'm 72 years old, known in Madison, Georgia as Architect Sarah. Those who see me today, recognized as one of the best architects in the Southeast, would never guess this same woman once lived through hell on earth. A hell built by my own father's hands and maintained by a family silenced by fear. If you're listening to this video, please write in the comments. I'm listening to you. It makes me happy knowing there are people in this world who still listen to others rather than ignoring them selfishly. I was born in 1953 in a simple frame house on the outskirts of Madison, Georgia, almost at the county line with Morgan County. It was a simple construction with dirt floors, peeling walls, and a roof that seemed ready to collapse during heavy rains. In our yard, we had a cherry tree, some scrawny chickens, and a mutt named Brave. The only creature in that house who looked at me with kindness. My father, Samuel Williams, was a construction worker. Rough hands, sun-weathered skin, small and restless eyes. He left early to work on construction sites around the region and returned at sunset. On good days, he came home tired, ate in silence, and went to sleep. On bad days, and those were the majority, he stopped at Joe's bar before coming home. I learned early to identify his footsteps. When they were firm and rhythmic, it meant he was sober, and perhaps that night would be peaceful. When they were dragged, stumbling, interspersed with loud laughter or grumbling, I knew a storm was coming. I'd run to my room, actually just a corner of the living room separated by a cotton curtain, and pretend to be asleep. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Women are only good for two things in this life, he used to say, spitting the words along with the whiskey breath. And neither of them is thinking. My mother, Elizabeth, was his opposite. Small, thin, with delicate hands despite the heavy work. She spoke little, almost whispering, as if afraid her voice would take up too much space. She worked as a washerwoman, taking in laundry from families in town. She woke before sunrise, lit the wood stove, made coffee, and went to the river with bundles of clothes. I watched her wither a little each day, like a flower slowly wilting from lack of sun. Her eyes, which in the few old photographs seemed alive and bright, had become opaque, distant, as if she was always looking somewhere far beyond those walls. My brother, Robert, was 5 years older than me. When we were little, we played together. He made wooden cars for me, taught me to fly kites, defended me from other children who picked on me. But when he turned 12, something changed. He started following my father, imitating how he talked, how he sat, how he looked at women on the street. Boys need to learn to be men early, my father would say proudly, patting his head. And for me, just a look of contempt. And girls need to learn to serve. The dinner table in our house was like a map of the power relationships in that family. My father sat at the head, Robert to his right, my mother and I on the other side. My father served himself first, then my brother. What was left, and often it was little, was for my mother and me. Men need to eat more. They're working, my mother justified when I complained of hunger. But my brother didn't work yet. He only studied, like me. The difference was that he had been born with what my father called the right tool. School was my only refuge. There, for a few hours, I could forget the smell of mold in our house, my father's shouting, my mother's silent crying. I loved learning, reading, discovering that there was a world beyond the mountains that surrounded our town. Teacher Mrs. Carmen said I had talent, that I was intelligent. "This girl will go far," she told my mother once, who smiled a sad smile, like someone who knows that some doors are born closed. I would bring the compliments home, proud, but soon learned to keep the words to myself. "What good is it for a girl to know how to read?" my father would grumble. "She'd better learn to cook properly, that's what." On market days, my mother would take me with her to help carry the purchases. I loved the colorful stalls, the smell of spices, the animated conversations. It was as if the entire town was celebrating. Once, I stopped in front of a toy stall, looking in wonder at a cloth doll. I had never had a real doll, only those I made myself with corn husks and fabric scraps. "Want this one, little girl?" asked the vendor, an elderly gentleman with white hair and a kind smile. Before I could answer, my mother pulled me by the arm. "We don't have money for that," she whispered. But I knew it wasn't just lack of money. It was fear. Fear that my father would discover we had spent money on a foolishness. With each passing year, Robert became more like my father. Not just in appearance, the same square jaw, the same small eyes, but in how he treated women as if we were less than people. "Go fetch water for me," he would order, even though he was closer to the water jug than I was. And if I delayed, there came the slap on the head, just like the ones my father gave my mother. At school, teachers complained about his behavior. They said he was aggressive with the girls, disrespectful to the female teachers. When my mother told this to my father, the answer was always the same. "Leave the boy alone. He's learning to be a man." Oh, I get emotional telling you these things. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because I want to meet each brave person following this painful story. And if you're enjoying it, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories from American grandmothers. Each of us has a life that could fill a book. When I turned 10, I received a gift from my teacher, a new notebook. It was a simple hardcover green notebook, but to me it was the most precious object in the world. I hid it under the mattress and only wrote in it when I was absolutely certain no one would see me. I wrote stories, poems, drawings. I created worlds where girls could be whatever they wanted. Astronauts, doctors, teachers. Worlds where fathers hugged their daughters and said they were proud of them. Worlds where no one was afraid. One day, my father found the notebook. I don't know how. Maybe he searched through my belongings while I was at school. When I got home, he was in the living room with the notebook open in his rough hands. "What garbage is this?" he asked, waving the notebook in the air. "Wasting time on this instead of helping your mother?" I was paralyzed, unable to answer. I watched as he tore out the pages one by one and threw them into the fire of the wood stove. My worlds, my dreams, all turning to ash before my eyes. I didn't shed a tear. I knew that crying would only make my father more furious. The fights at home were constant. Anything could trigger them. Dinner not ready on time, a poorly ironed shirt, a look my father interpreted as defiant. Nights were the worst. I would lie in bed, listening to the shouting, the sounds of things being broken, my mother's sobs. "Why doesn't she leave?" I would ask myself. Only much later did I understand the invisible chains that bound my mother to that life. Financial dependence, fear, shame, the distorted belief that it was normal or deserved. Sometimes, Mrs. Dolores, our neighbor, would appear the next day with a plate of food or a homemade remedy for the bruises. She never spoke directly about the bruises on my mother's face, about the eyes swollen from crying. It was a silent agreement. She offered help without asking questions. My mother accepted without giving explanations. The worst was when my father was in a good mood. He seemed like another person. He would joke, bring small gifts, talk about plans for the future. In these moments, I saw my mother fill with hope, as if she believed he had finally changed. I knew better. The calm was just the harbinger of another storm. On Sundays, we went to church. My father transformed completely. He put on his best clothes, combed his hair carefully, smiled at acquaintances. "A blessed family," the church ladies would say, looking at the four of us sitting on the church bench. If they only knew what happened when we closed the door at home. When I turned 11, my body started to change. My mother quickly, shamefully, explained to me about women's things. She warned that I needed to be even more careful now, that I should dress decently, not draw attention. At the time, I didn't quite understand the reason for so much fear. Unfortunately, I would discover in the worst possible way. My childhood was this constant, walking in the shadows, trying to be invisible, trying not to provoke the wrath of my father or my brother, who each day became more a reflection of him. I lived in fear, in shame, with a constant knot in my throat. I dreamed of the day when I would be big enough to run away from that house, take my mother with me, start a new life. But before that day came, something happened that changed everything. Something so terrible that, even after 60 years, still makes me wake up in the middle of the night, sweating and with my heart racing. It was on a Wednesday, March 10th, 1965. I was 12 years old and woke up with a strong stomachache. That day, which began like so many others, would become the mark that would divide my life into before and after. A day I would carry forever in my memory, like a scar that never completely fades. The day, everything changed. "I'm not going to school today, Mom. I have a really bad stomachache." That was the first thing I said that Wednesday morning, March 10th, 1965, when my mother came to my corner to wake me up. I had spent the entire night tossing and turning in bed with cramps that felt like stab wounds. On Sunday, I had eaten cornbread at our neighbor Mrs. Dolores's house, and I think the dough was spoiled because my stomach had been upset all night. My mother placed her hand on my forehead, concerned. "You don't have a fever, honey. Are you sure you can't go?" In her eyes, I saw the fear. She knew what it meant for me to miss school, especially on a day when my father hadn't left for work. That week, the construction site where he was working had stopped due to lack of materials, and he was at home, more irritable than usual for not earning his daily wage. "I can't get up, Mom. My stomach hurts too much," I insisted, holding my abdomen and curling up. I really wasn't pretending. The pain was real, so strong it made me nauseous. My mother sighed, resigned. "All right, I'll leave some mint tea ready before I go to work. Stay in bed and drink it when it cools down a bit." She had to go. The laundry wouldn't wait, and if she missed work, she could lose her customers. In those days, there was no such thing as a doctor's note for a domestic worker, especially a washerwoman who worked independently. My mother left at 6 in the morning, as always, with that expression of someone going to battle, not to work. I stayed in bed, wrapped in the thin blanket, listening to the sounds of the house. My brother Robert was also home that day. He also complained of a stomachache at breakfast. He probably had eaten the same cornbread as I did at Mrs. Dolores's house. He was 17 at the time and already worked with my father on some construction sites. But since they didn't have work that week, he was on forced leave. I heard when my father got up, around 8 in the morning. His heavy footsteps down the hallway always gave me a chill in my stomach. I closed my eyes and pretended to sleep when he stopped at the entrance to my corner. He stood there, still for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity. Then he muttered something and went to the kitchen. The smell of strong coffee reached me, along with the sound of the chair scraping on the cement floor. He must have been sitting at the table, drinking coffee and reading the old newspaper that a neighbor always gave him. My father didn't know how to read properly, but he liked looking at the photos and pretending he understood the news. I don't know how much time passed until I heard his voice calling my brother. "Robert, come here." The voice was harsh, as always, but didn't seem irritated. Yet, I heard my brother's footsteps, lighter than my father's, but already with that firmness of someone transforming into a man. "What is it, Dad? Weren't you supposed to work with me today at Mr. Manuel's construction site?" "Yes, Dad, but I have a terrible stomachache. I think it was the cornbread we ate yesterday at Mrs. Dolores's house." Silence. I could almost feel my father chewing his words before releasing them. He hated when something was out of his control, when we didn't follow exactly what he had planned. "And your sister? She didn't go to school today either?" "I don't think so, Dad. She was complaining about the same pain." More silence. Then, the sound of the chair scraping again, louder this time. His footsteps coming toward my corner. My heart accelerated so much it felt like it would jump out of my mouth. The cotton curtain was pulled forcefully, letting in the brightness that hurt my eyes. There he was, occupying the entire entrance to my small space, his silhouette dark against the light coming from the living room window. "So the princess also has a tummy ache?" His voice had that dangerous tone, that calm that precedes the explosion. I sat up in bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin as if that piece of cloth could protect me. "Yes, Dad. It hurts a lot." He took a step into my corner, looking me up and down. There was something different in his look that day. Something I had never seen before, and that made me feel a cold shiver down my spine. "You're missing school for a little tummy ache? Since when is my girl this weak?" I didn't answer. Any word could be the wrong one, and I already knew all too well the weight of his hand. "Get up. If you're going to miss school, you're going to do something useful." I tried to get up, but the pain was too strong. I could barely sit on the edge of the bed. My father lost his patience. In a quick movement, he yanked away the blanket that protected me and pulled me by the arm with such force I thought it would break. "Dad, it hurts a lot," I cried, trying to free myself. The slap came straight to my face. I tasted blood in my mouth. He had never hit me with such force before. "Now you're going to miss school and work like a slut to learn never to miss your education again. You're already stupid for being a woman, girl." He dragged me down the hallway to his and my mother's bedroom. My stomach was churning. I don't know if from fear or from the stomachache that still persisted. When we got there, he threw me on the bed forcefully. He went to the door and shouted, "Robert, come here now!" My brother appeared at the door, still in pajamas, with a pale and sweaty face. He was clearly also sick, but my father didn't care. "Now you're going to show that you're a real man," my father said to Robert, pointing at me on the bed. "You're going to teach your sister a lesson." Robert looked confused at my father, not understanding. Until that moment, despite imitating many of my father's bad attitudes, my brother had never been violent with me. Annoying, bossy, yes, but he had never really hurt me. "Dad, what are you talking about?" My brother's voice was trembling. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. It wasn't the same arrogant Robert who imitated my father, who treated me like a servant. At that moment, he seemed as frightened as I was. "I'm saying you're going to show her what happens to a woman who doesn't know her place. You're going to use her the way a woman should be used." My heart froze. I didn't fully understand what my father meant, but I knew it was something terrible. Robert also understood, because he took a step back, shaking his head. "I can't do that, Dad. She's my sister." My father's face contorted into an expression I'll never forget. It was pure hatred. "If you don't do what your father is telling you, son, you're going to get beaten until your teeth fall out, until you learn." My father pushed Robert into the room and closed the door. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move. Robert looked at the floor, the walls, anywhere but at me. "Dad, please," I begged, with tears streaming down my face. But there was no mercy in that man. He grabbed Robert by the shirt and pushed him in my direction. "You're going to do what I'm telling you, or you'll get beaten until you can't stand up. And then you'll see what I myself am going to do to her." What happened next is something I try to erase from my memory every day for almost 60 years. My own brother, trembling and crying, was forced to do things to me that no brother should do to a sister. My father stayed there, watching everything, with a sick smile on his face. I closed my eyes and disconnected from my body. It was as if I were floating above the scene, watching everything happen to another person. It couldn't be me there on that bed being violated. It couldn't be. During the entire time, my father kept giving instructions, telling Robert what he should do as if he were teaching a trade. "This is how you deal with women," he would say, with that voice that seemed to come from the bottom of a well. "They're made for this." The physical pain was terrible, but worse still was the confusion in my head. That was my father, the man who should protect me. That was my brother, who had once taught me to fly kites. How could they be doing this to me? When it finally ended, my brother ran out of the room, vomiting in the hallway. I heard the sound of the front door slamming. He had run away to the street. I remained there, motionless, feeling a pain that went far beyond the physical. It was as if something inside me had broken forever. My father was still in the room, adjusting himself, putting his pants back in place. It was only then that I realized what had happened. He hadn't just forced my brother to violate me. He had felt pleasure in watching. "Now you've learned," he said before leaving the room, leaving me alone with my pain and shame. I don't know how long I stayed there, between sheets stained with blood and tears. It could have been minutes or hours. Time had lost meaning. When I finally managed to get up, my entire body ached. I dragged myself to the bathroom and stayed under the shower, scrubbing my skin until it was red, as if I could wash away what had happened. The cold water fell on me, but I didn't feel it. It was as if I were anesthetized, unable to feel anything beyond that horrible emptiness that had settled inside me. I scrubbed and scrubbed, but the feeling of filth wouldn't go away. It would never completely go away. I returned to my corner and wrapped myself in the blanket, shivering not from cold, but from shock. I couldn't cry. The tears had dried up, as if my body understood that crying wouldn't help anything. No one would come to save me. The hours dragged on. I heard my father leave the house, slamming the door. He had probably gone to the bar, as he always did when he wasn't working. I stayed there, curled up, praying that he wouldn't return, that some miracle would happen, and I would never have to look at that face again. When my mother came home from work in the late afternoon, I was still in the same position. She came into my corner and immediately knew that something terrible had happened. Maybe it was the smell. Despite the shower, I hadn't been able to remove that odor of sweat and shame that seemed impregnated in my skin. Maybe it was the empty look in my eyes, or maybe it was that intuition that mothers have, that sixth sense that alerts them when something is very wrong. "What happened, my daughter?" she asked, sitting on the edge of the bed and touching my face carefully. I couldn't answer. The words were stuck in my throat, as if saying them out loud would make everything more real. Before she could insist, we heard the front door. My father had returned. My mother got up quickly, panic visible in her eyes. "The girl missed school, had a stomachache. I taught her a lesson. I don't want to see you pampering this girl who skipped school," he shouted from the hallway, even before seeing my mother. She looked at me, then in the direction of his voice, divided between the instinct to protect me and the fear of what he might do. As always, fear won. She left my corner, closing the curtain behind her. I heard their voices in the kitchen, his loud and arrogant, hers low and submissive. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I didn't need to. It was always the same conversation, the same pattern. He accusing, she apologizing for things she hadn't even done. My brother didn't return home that night. I found out later that he had gone to a friend's house, saying he had fought with my father. I stayed there, alone with my trauma, unable to eat, to drink, to do anything beyond existing in that state of numbness. The days that followed were a blur. I didn't go to school for the rest of the week. My mother told the teacher I had a strong virus. It wasn't a lie. I was constantly vomiting, my body rejecting the memory of what had happened. When my brother finally returned, 3 days later, he couldn't look at me. He would pass by my corner as if I were invisible, avoiding being in the same room as me. In the rare moments when our gazes crossed, I saw in him a mixture of shame, guilt, and something else. Perhaps anger at himself, perhaps anger at me for being the living reminder of what he had been forced to do. As for my father, he acted as if nothing had happened. He continued his usual routine, work, bar, fights. Sometimes he would catch my brother looking at him with a mixture of fear and hatred and would say, "What's up, son? Becoming a real man now, aren't you?" The following week, I returned to school. It was as if I were moving inside a dream, disconnected from everything around me. Teacher Mrs. Carmen noticed the change in me. I, who had always been participative, interested, now barely raised my eyes from the notebook. "What happened, Sarah?" "You're different," she asked me one day after class. I couldn't answer. How to explain the inexplicable? How to put that horror into words? I just shook my head and ran away. Nights were the worst. I couldn't sleep without reliving everything in vivid nightmares, so real that I would wake up screaming in a cold sweat. My mother would come running, hug me, murmur words of comfort, but never asked about the nightmares. Maybe she knew. Maybe she just suspected. But silence was the language of our house. The months went by, and I learned to live in that state of numbness. I would go to school, come back home, do the household chores, everything like a robot, without really being present. It was as if the real Sarah had died that March day, and only an empty shell continued walking, breathing, existing. My father continued to be the same violent man as always, but something had changed in the dynamics of our house. It was as if that terrible act had opened a wound that would never completely close. My brother was increasingly distant, spending most of his time away from home. When he was present, he drank more and more, imitating my father in this aspect as well. One night, about 6 months after the incident, I heard my mother crying in her room. It wasn't the usual crying after a fight with my father. It was a different crying, deeper, as if it came from the soul. Gathering all the courage I had, I entered her room. My father wasn't home. He had gone to the bar as he did every night. "Mom, what's wrong?" I asked, sitting next to her on the bed. She looked at me with those tired eyes, red from crying. For a moment, I thought she wasn't going to answer, that she was going to send me back to my corner. But then she did something that surprised me. She took my hands between hers and squeezed them tightly. "My daughter," she said, with a voice that seemed to come from very far away. "You can't let him destroy you. You can't let him win." It was the first time my mother spoke openly about the situation, even if in a veiled way. She didn't mention the abuse directly, but her words made it clear that she knew, or at least suspected, what had happened. "How do you stand it, Mom?" I asked, breaking my own silence for the first time in months. She sighed, looking at her own hands, calloused from the hard work of a lifetime of subordination. "I endure it for you, to protect you as much as I can. One day we'll get out of here, I promise." I didn't really believe in that promise. It seemed impossible to escape that life, but something in my mother's determined look gave me a thread of hope to hold on to. That night, I did something I hadn't done since the day of the abuse. I cried. Not the silent crying that had become my companion on lonely nights, but a loud, convulsive crying that seemed to come from the depths of my being. I cried for everything I had lost, for the stolen childhood, for the destroyed innocence. I cried for the girl I was and would never be again. My mother hugged me, rocked me as she did when I was little. She didn't say anything. There were no words that could fix what was broken. But in that embrace, I felt for the first time that I wasn't completely alone. The months turned into years. I turned 13, 14, 15, always living in that house of horrors, always fearing my father's next fit of rage, always avoiding being alone with him. School continued to be my only refuge, the only place where I could be just Sarah, not Samuel's daughter, not the girl who carried a terrible secret. My brother Robert, at 20, was becoming more and more like my father in some aspects, the way of walking, of talking, the addiction to drinking. But something in him had broken on that fateful day. He never again had the same arrogance, the same cockiness. It was as if he carried an invisible weight on his back, a guilt that no amount of whiskey could erase. My mother and I developed a silent form of communication. A look, a gesture was enough to alert us about my father's mood, about when it was better to disappear, to become invisible. We survived one day at a time, clinging to the promise that one day we would escape that hell. And then, when I was 16, something happened that changed everything again. I don't know if it was coincidence or if it was destiny finally deciding that we had suffered enough. It all started on a Friday afternoon when my father came home earlier from work, already drunk and in a terrible mood. The escape. After that terrible day, living in the same house as my father and my brother was like breathing with a stone in my chest. Every corner of that house had become a trap. Every shadow hid a nightmare. I was no longer a girl, that Sarah died in that bed along with my innocence. What remained was an empty shell, trying to survive one day at a time. During the 4 years that followed, between my 12 and 16 years, I learned to become invisible. I woke up before everyone else, at 5 in the morning, just to avoid meeting my father in the kitchen. I would return from school and hide in my corner, behind that cotton curtain that was my only protection. I did my household chores in absolute silence, like a shadow moving through the house. The less they noticed my presence, the better. I started saving every penny I could get. Sometimes, Mrs. Carmen, my teacher, would give me some change to buy school supplies. I saved every last cent, hiding the coins in a hole I had dug under the bed, protected by a loose board. I didn't know when, but one day that money would be my ticket away from there. My mother and I never talked directly about what happened that day. It was as if we had made a silent pact, not mentioning the horror so as not to give it more power. But I saw in her eyes that she knew. When my father wasn't around, she treated me with special care, a silent affection that said, "I know what you're going through, daughter. I'm here." Once a month, my mother would get some extra change from her employers and buy a glycerin soap for me. It was a huge luxury at that time, but she insisted. "It's good for the skin," she would say, but I knew what it really meant. It was her way of saying that I wasn't dirty, that what had happened hadn't stained me forever. My brother Robert sank into drinking after that day. At 18, he was already known in the town bars as Samuel's son, always involved in fights, always with that lost look of someone carrying too heavy a burden. He avoided being alone with me at all costs. If I entered the living room, he would leave. If we were at the table, he would barely raise his eyes from his plate. One night, almost a year after the incident, Robert came home so drunk he could barely stand. My father wasn't there. He had gone to visit a friend in another town and would only return the next day. Robert collapsed in the kitchen chair where I was finishing washing the dinner dishes. For a moment, we stayed there, in an uncomfortable silence, the first time we were alone since that day. "I'm sorry," he suddenly muttered, his voice thick with whiskey. "I'm sorry, Sarah." I didn't answer. What could I say? Those apologies didn't erase what had happened, didn't heal the wounds that were still bleeding inside me. "I should have been beaten to death, but I shouldn't have done that," he continued, now with tears streaming down his face. "I can't look at myself in the mirror. I can't sleep without seeing, without remembering." He hid his face in his hands and began to sob, a grown man's crying that seemed like that of a lost boy. For a brief moment, I felt sorry for him. He had also been a victim of my father in a way, but the pity soon gave way to anger. Pity didn't erase what he had done to me. "Robert, go to sleep," was all I managed to say, before retreating to my corner, leaving him there with his guilt and his whiskey. The next morning, he was gone. We found out later that he had enlisted in the army and been sent to a base in Atlanta. Part of me felt relief at not having to see him every day, at not having to relive that memory every time our gazes crossed. Another part resented that he could escape, while I remained trapped in that house with my father. My father pretended to be sad when he learned that Robert had left, but I saw the gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. Now it was just him, the man of the house, with 2 women completely under his control. Without Robert around, he got even worse, as if he no longer had anyone to impress, no one to teach how to be a man. The years of 1966 and 1967 were the hardest. My father lost his job at the construction company where he had worked for years. He drank so much that he started missing work until the foreman lost his patience. After that, he only got occasional odd jobs, which meant he had much more time at home. Too much time. The money, which was already little, became even scarcer. My mother had to work more hours, wash more clothes, to compensate for what my father no longer brought in. I also started to help, doing cleaning in family homes on Saturdays. All the money I earned I gave to my mother, who used it to buy food. But there was always a little bit left that she secretly gave back to me. "Save it, daughter. One day you'll need it." At school, I continued to stand out, despite everything. Studying was my only escape, the only way to travel far from that reality. I clung to books like a castaway to a piece of wood. Teacher Mrs. Carmen continued to encourage me. "You have a gift, Sarah. Don't let anyone take that away from you." When I turned 14, in 1967, Mrs. Carmen called me after class. "I have a proposal to make to you," she said, with that direct manner she always had. "I'm giving private tutoring lessons to Dr. Thompson's children. It's too much for me alone. You could help me and earn a little money." Dr. Thompson was the town doctor, a respected man, owner of one of the most beautiful houses in Madison. His children studied at the private school in Covington, but came home on weekends. They needed help with English and math, precisely the subjects in which I excelled. "But teacher, I don't know if I can—" "I've never taught anyone," I replied, insecure. "You know more than you think, Sarah, and you'll gain experience. Besides, you'll be paid for it. $5 per lesson. What do you think?" $5 per lesson was more than I earned in an entire week of cleaning. It was a fortune to me at the time. I accepted immediately, without even thinking about how I would explain it to my father. When I told my mother, she was worried. "Your father won't like you spending so much time in rich people's houses," she said, twisting her apron between her fingers, a sign that she was nervous. "We don't need to tell him what I'm doing there," I replied. "You can say I'm helping the teacher carry books, clean the classroom, anything." My mother didn't like to lie, but in that house, lying had become a survival tool. She agreed, reluctantly. To my surprise, my father didn't object. At that time, he was already so deep into drinking that he barely paid attention to what was happening around him, as long as his immediate orders were obeyed and the food was on the table. "As long as it doesn't interfere with the housework," was all he said. The private tutoring opened a new world for me. Dr. Thompson's house was like a palace in my eyes. Polished wooden floor, real furniture, not those improvised things we had at home. A bookshelf that went from floor to ceiling. And the most impressive, a bathroom inside the house, with running water. I started giving lessons to the two youngest children, Elizabeth, who was 9, and Thomas, who was 11. They were well-educated children, but a bit spoiled, as was to be expected from a doctor's children. At first, they looked at me with suspicion. After all, I was just a poor girl from the countryside. What could I teach them? But soon, I gained their trust with my patience and my knowledge. Dr. Thompson's wife, Mrs. Catherine, always treated me with respect. She offered coffee with cake when I arrived, asked about my studies, lent me books from the family library. It was a treatment I had never received from an adult besides my teacher. One day, after about 3 months of giving lessons, Mrs. Catherine called me for a private conversation. "Sarah, I've noticed how intelligent and dedicated you are. My husband and I talked, and we would like to offer you an opportunity. We know the principal of Covington Academy, where our children study. They have a scholarship program for underprivileged students with good academic performance. We would like to recommend you." I was speechless. Covington Academy was one of the best schools in the region, attended only by the children of the most affluent families. I had never dreamed of studying in a place like that. But how would I get to Covington every day? I asked, thinking of the distance of almost 30 kilometers between the cities. "There's a school bus that passes through Madison picking up students," she explained. "It's part of the scholarship." "Of course. You would have to talk to your parents. It's an important decision." Talk to my parents. That was the hardest part. I knew exactly what my father would say. That it was a waste of time, that a woman's place wasn't studying in a rich school, that I had to stay home helping my mother. But an opportunity like that might never appear again. I told my mother first, of course. She was divided between the joy of seeing me having a chance that she never had and the fear of my father's reaction. "It's a blessing, daughter," she said, with tears in her eyes. "But your father—" "I know, Mom, but I have to try. It's my only chance to get out of here someday, to have a different life." We decided that we would approach my father together, at a moment when he was in a good mood, which was increasingly rare. We waited for a Saturday when he had been paid for a construction job and was satisfied because he could buy his whiskey. To our surprise, he didn't react with the explosion of anger we expected. Instead, he stayed silent for a long time, which was almost more frightening. "Rich school, huh?" he said finally, looking at me with those small, penetrating eyes. "And who's going to pay for that?" I explained about the scholarship, about the bus, about how it wouldn't cost him anything. I emphasized that I would continue to help at home, that I would do my chores before leaving and after returning. "And what are you going to do with all this studying? Educated women only serve to give orders, to become stuck up. No man will want to marry you." I bit my tongue to avoid responding. Marriage was the last thing I wanted in life, after seeing my parents' marriage. But saying that would be signing my own sentence. "It's an opportunity, Dad," was all I said, looking at the floor, in the submissive posture I had learned to adopt. He muttered something unintelligible, took another sip of whiskey, and then said the words that changed my life. "Do what you want, but don't come crying to me when it doesn't work out." It wasn't exactly an enthusiastic permission, but it was all I needed. The next day, I ran to Dr. Thompson's house to say I accepted the opportunity. In March 1968, at 15 years old, I started studying at Covington Academy. I woke up at 5 in the morning, did my household chores, and caught the school bus at 6:30. I returned at 4 in the afternoon and still had time to help my mother with dinner and tidying the house. The school was everything I had imagined, and more. Spacious and airy classrooms, a library with thousands of books, a science laboratory, even a sports court. At first, I felt completely out of place. My uniform was second-hand, donated by a former student, and was a bit big on me. My shoes were the same ones I used at the public school, already worn and patched. The other girls, daughters of farmers, merchants, and professionals, looked at me with curiosity, and, some, with disdain. But soon, my performance in classes began to draw attention. The teachers noticed how I absorbed each new piece of information, how I participated in discussions, how my essays and assignments were always among the best. I began to earn the respect of my colleagues, if not their friendship. Studying at Covington Academy opened horizons I didn't even know existed. I learned about art, literature, sciences, world history, things I would never have learned at the small public school in Madison. For the first time, I began to glimpse a future beyond the mountains of the countryside, beyond the life of deprivation and fear that I knew. Oh, you can't imagine how hard it was to balance these two worlds. During the day, I was the promising student at Covington Academy, discussing Mark Twain and quadratic equations. At night, I returned to being Samuel's daughter, the girl who had to lower her head and become invisible to not provoke her father's wrath. Things at home didn't improve during this period. My father continued drinking, continued to be violent with my mother. The only difference was that now he spent less time at home, which was a relief for both of us. I would arrive from school, hug my mother, and we could have a few hours of peace before he returned from the bar. One of the teachers at Covington Academy, Mrs. Margaret, became my mentor. She taught literature and had a way of talking about books that made the stories come alive. It was she who first mentioned the possibility of college. "You have the potential to go much further, Sarah," she said one day, after reading my analysis of The Great Gatsby. "Have you thought about taking the entrance exam?" College seemed like a dream as distant as going to the moon. No one in my family